Working Cows Podcast, Episode 4.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
This episode of the Working Cows Podcast is brought to you by Kamak Ranch Supply. Check out their website at kamakranchsupply.com. They understand the needs of ranchers and farmers, whether you need to take care of your livestock, horses, or even building supplies. They have everything you need to work your cows, whether that be the chute you work them through, the water you bring them to, or the tools you use to make them go up that chute a little bit faster. So check out their website at kamakranchsupply.com. This episode has been brought to you in part by chriswilliamsaudio.com. If you're a musician, podcaster, or filmmaker, don't settle for audio that's less than professional. Head on over to chriswilliamsaudio.com for all your podcasting, music production, and film audio needs. Our guest today on the Working Cows Podcast is Dave Olala. Dave is a South Dakota State University Extension agent. He is a sheep specialist. He is also a producer in Newell, South Dakota. He runs a cow-calf operation, as well as a sheep production operation. Dave has some very interesting things to say about his winter feeding strategy and some of the benefits he has been experiencing from it. So I thought it would be very helpful for all of us to sit down with Dave today and hear from him about his winter feeding strategy, some of the benefits he's been receiving from it, as far as soil health and forage production, as well as animal performance. So Dave, would you mind introducing yourself just a little bit? Thanks for being my guest here on the Working Cows Podcast.
Yeah, Dave Olala, SDSU Extension Field Specialist. Sheep is my emphasis, and I also ranch east of Newell, South Dakota, about 10 miles. We've got about 250 acres of irrigated ground and run sheep and cattle.
Well, I appreciate you joining me today. I'm looking forward to it. We're kind of in the middle of a series here on the Working Cows Podcast on winter feeding, and I have had the opportunity to come and visit your place and see what you're doing there with your winter feeding strategy. So I kind of just want to spend some time today talking through the benefits of what you're doing and kind of your strategy. So maybe let's start off with your strategy. How are you feeding through the winter?
Okay, so back up a little bit on the reason I've adopted these strategies and practices is through my day job with Extension and the sheep enterprise is trying to work with people to find a way to have livestock on the land. And I do a lot of work with the USDA NRCS personnel regarding the rangeland health and soil health initiatives, as well as with Dr. Dwayne Beck with Dakota Lakes Research Station and SDSU. In that case, the idea is trying to develop a sustainable model and system that can help profitability for producers. So I've been implementing that myself, and a lot of these practices have been commonly done and routinely done by producers over the years. We're just putting a little different slant or a little more science to it to determine or predict a better outcome in providing a more sustainable system. So getting to the winter feeding strategies is this. We've got a number of objectives as we approach that. Obviously, we want good nutrition and health for the livestock, both cattle and sheep. And in that case, we are feeding out on cropland. And cropland is a good opportunity to remove those animals from a confinement setting where you can have those health issues occur, and it at the same time serves a number of other objectives, which would include nutrient cycling and such as carbon back to the soil, as well as when you're feeding out there, that residue or that crop, part of the crop that they don't eat or that they cycle through the animal itself in the form of manure and urine, goes right back to the ground. The residue provides great cover for your soil, and if you employ a no-till system, it really enhances the effectiveness of that system because the residue is holding all the moisture in the soil in. So we're serving ourselves that way. Additionally, a part of that winter feeding strategy out in the cropland, if you strategically place your feed resources near there, and especially in western South Dakota, where most of our cropland is a forage type crop that we're putting into a bale form, by placing them near the cropland with the intent to feed back out there, we've done a number of things, and that would include not hauling feed in to a confined feedlot area, and in turn not having to haul manure out. It's all done just within a quarter mile of where that cropland is in many cases. So that requires a few other logistical things and infrastructure, which would include providing some windbreak or shelter out there, especially in the climates that we have in South Dakota during those harsh winter months, to at least provide some wind protection from those animals. They can do pretty well in that winter maintenance feeding out in the open, as long as they've got the groceries to do it and have some protection from the wind. And then having a plan if blizzards or really bad weather moves in, to move them closer or into better protection. Additionally, then the other thing that comes into planning in winter feeding on cropland would include water sources and how you're going to provide that. Sheep, in their case, as long as you have snow on the ground, their water needs are lessened greatly. Seldom do they need additional water unless it gets pretty froze or the snow dries out. Although they say that you can do that with cattle, I think we struggle harder to provide a water source through snow on cattle in the northern plains, just because of the movement of the snow and how fast the snow dries out of moisture. So as we plan those things, in placing and feeding out on cropland, we have to consider some other logistics regarding what if it thaws out, or what if it rains or gets too muddy, and we've got all that animal impact on the land. That being the case, we need to identify sacrifice areas or sodded areas that during that term of soft ground or inclement weather, we can move those livestock off so we don't damage that surface that's so precious to us on the crop side. And then the other thing to think about is, as we place that residue, we have to do it somewhat systematically so that we can cover the cropland pretty uniformly and not condense it into one area. But in my implementation of those practices, it certainly shows that there is a lot of value and potential in both animal health, animal nutrition, and then cropland health. And so we see the potential to move and apply that even greater to some degrees on our tame pastures and our alfalfa fields, although we'll have to think about how we do the residue a little differently.
Sure. Yeah, that's a lot of helpful information there. I'd kind of like to maybe go back through and work through some of the pieces that you mentioned there in a little bit more detail. First of all, I think let's start with the benefits. In my understanding and what I saw happening at your place when I toured it was that you were taking the nutrients off in the form of a hay bale, and then you're putting those same nutrients back on the field that they came off of you're using a hay buster or a bale processor, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So in that planning, and again, with us running sheep and then even keeping some replacement heifers back, we've used a hay buster model that's called a second cut, but then Vermeer and Highline and some of those make those that will process that hay a lot finer down to that inch and a half stem length, which I felt was necessary both for the livestock to make better use out of that, but also anything that gets left is in a finer form so that that residue will fit better against the ground and then decompose probably faster in my thinking in those regards. So just trying to plan that out. And then when we're feeding, we certainly try to make passes and never go over the same area twice until we've covered an entire field. And then we work our way back across it, kind of a checkerboard system.
Sure.
And it certainly seemed, part of the goal that I didn't touch on was that whole nutrient cycling and in a forage cropping system, we're always removing minerals and nutrients from the soil. And so part of our goal is to return that to the same place from where it came. And in that case, not only are we helping ourselves that way and improving our soil health, but we're certainly reducing our dependency on chemical fertilizers because we're bringing that same nutrients back to the soil and cycling it through an animal, and which in my mind is the best case scenario because we're converting that forage into red meat, and then what we don't is going right back to the soil that it came from.
Sure. And have you done studies as far as organic matter and some of that stuff?
Yes, it's certainly too soon to give a definitive, but we certainly know that applying residue in the form of like feed or in manure, that you're going to increase your soil organic matter, albeit that it's, the percentages are in the tenths and hundreds many times, but we're moving the right way. And I would expect over a period of 10 to 20 years that we should be able to build our soils, especially to function and act like native prairie should. And that's my goal, which then again would reduce our highs and lows, or peaks and valleys regarding feast or famine on crop production years. If we can predict our production despite the climate, I think that would certainly help our bottom line.
Sure. So you've kind of outlined your strategy of the actual feeding of the forage material and how you feed it across the whole field, try to get to every corner of the field so that they are evenly spreading out that manure and that urine into the field. What about the actual crop rotation, or how you handle what you're actually growing to be turned into a hay bale?
Well, certainly. So it ties back into that soil health initiative. There's 5 principles that run into that. Certainly go to no-till farming, crop residue on the soil, integrate livestock. And then another big part of that is diversity in your plants so that you support all and make use of all those nutrients and organic matter and get it cycling and functioning like a native prairie would. So in that case, there's some things that we need to accept and understand. In western South Dakota and a lot of the northern plains, especially in the semi-arid areas of those regions, we're forage-based. And there's alfalfa fields or grass alfalfa fields out in this country that have been in existence for 30 or 40 years. And you have to think about that every year you take a cutting and you remove that, and many times it doesn't come back, or you're not bringing those nutrients back. And seldom do a lot of these ranchers put any investment or inputs in the form of fertilizer back onto those soils. If we're doing that, over time we're going to degrade that soil, and it's just not going to provide what we need. So thinking down the road into the next generations of 50, 100, 200 years, we need to develop a system that's going to be more regenerative. And in this forage-based system, I think and certainly believe in my own operation, this is the direction we need to be taking to, again, always trying to produce more on the same amount or less acres and do it at a lower cost. And this initiative seems to put in those pieces into a system that is going to provide that consistently from year to year. So that being said, then we look at those reductions in fertilizers, but increase in production can certainly help these dryland forage systems and even the irrigated systems to a greater extent in being highly productive and certainly improving the profitability, or at least by more production, reducing the cost of input per unit to make those producers more profitable.
Sure. We're talking with Dave Olola of South Dakota Extension today about his winter feeding strategy and some of the benefits they have been experiencing from that. We're going to take a quick break and thank our sponsors, and after we get back from the break, we'll continue this discussion. This episode has been brought to you in part by Kamak Ranch Supply. Check out their website at kamakranchsupply.com. All right, we're back with Dave Olola from South Dakota Extension. We're talking about the winter feeding strategy that he has implemented and the soil health initiative. I only counted 4 things that you mentioned in the soil health initiative: no-till, crop residue, integrate livestock, and plant variant or multiple species of plants, plant diversity.
Yeah, and then rotational cropping systems.
Okay, and did we touch on the rotational cropping systems?
Well, yeah, that's what the rotational cropping systems with the diversity. But the other thing I forgot, and you were out and got to see it, is integrating the cover crops into the system as well. And the point of the crop is that 5th principle of keeping a living plant in the soil as long as you can throughout the year, not just during the growing season, but throughout the year. And people don't always get that. But what's so cool about this soil health initiative and how it makes sense to me is from a ranch and a rangeland grass manager point of view, that's what you do with rangelands, is you manage them that way. You keep cover. You maintain diversity by rotating your grazing and by making sure you don't overgraze at the same time or overgraze any time, but you try to vary your grazing so those different plants can thrive and stay within the ecosystem in a nice, diverse plant composition. And then you think about, certainly there's no-till farming in rangeland, that you're not doing any of that. And how did the native rangelands in the northern plains develop? Through the impact of animals on there, buffalo and antelope and deer, and we've replaced them with cattle and sheep. So those that understand rangeland management can adopt and adapt those principles right into their cropland, which for me, it's quite an aha moment.
Sure. Yeah, and that was really, as a member of the High Plains Ranch Practicum, that was what they focused on the first 2 days of classes, convincing us that we are in the business of growing grass.
Right. Yeah, we're forage people.
Right, and managing grass and managing forage and making sure that we're leaving it better than we found it, and giving it an opportunity to recover, especially during the growing season, and some of those different things that I think some of the practices that have been in place for a long time have at least been neutral, if not a detriment to soil health.
Certainly, and we knew what we knew and did what we had available. But as our science improves and we're able to demonstrate that through research, and certainly like places like the Dakota Lakes Farm there near Pierre, it's a living, working example of how that can be a better way.
Yep, and every episode thus far of the Working Cows podcast, I think the issue of adaptability has come up, and you've mentioned it already, that you've got to have some sacrifice ground that you can go to if it does warm up, if it does thaw out, if it does rain. Can you talk about how you would go about picking that sacrifice ground?
Well, some of it's just going to be that ground that's marginal or that fits what you have set up for infrastructure to begin with. But that doesn't mean you despoil it and ruin it. It just means that you try to create that in a perennial setting of heavy sodded grasses, and even your feedlots and calving areas that get a lot of early spring wet treading. We're using our no-till drill to drill into them and break them up and develop some residue and some diversity into those areas, which many times are crested wheat type scenarios that can improve and provide more production and opportunity for us even in the sacrifice ground. So although we call it sacrifice, we're still managing those areas as well as valued parts of our land resource. But it's just many times they may be a high gravelly knob that's going to keep things higher and drier, and we don't have a lot of production on them. But if we start running a lot of residue there, we're going to improve that soil health. Likewise, down in some of those bottoms tend to be some toe slopes and some alkali and saline seeps that freeze up in the wintertime. Can get some cover over them. Yeah, there's some wonderful native grasses that will do well in them. Western wheatgrass is one of them. So we have opportunity in those sacrifice areas to even improve them by concentrating animals, but using them to keep from putting too much compaction, especially at the wrong time on that cropland. And that, obviously we've got to respect the concerns of farmers who don't have livestock or don't understand the compaction and truly the lack thereof that they actually make on the soil surface, to show and demonstrate to them and that there is value and potential for both of farmers and ranchers to make arrangements to bring livestock on to clean up some of that residue, but again, leave enough to provide cover and food for the soil.
You mentioned concentrating livestock in some of these sacrifice areas. Can you talk about the benefits of the specific sacrifice area you were referring to when you talked about concentrating livestock?
So we get, the ideal setting is in the winter. You have a blizzard moving in. We have windbreaks and all winter water tanks set up in those sacrifice areas that we can shut that livestock in, whether it's cattle or sheep. One, it obviously helps from drifting and breaking out, because these areas are 30 to 40 acre fenced areas, and you would hope they'd stay behind the windbreaks, but sometimes they blow out. But in that case, hoping that the fences would hold them in most cases and turn them back. So those sacrifice areas, then what I've done in a number of mine is seeded them to a mixture of cool season wheat grasses, saltlander and western, and then grazing alfalfas, in the idea of cycling nutrients into that while those animals are held in those areas, and we feed them right there with the processors, same type of system of trying not to feed in the same place twice, and serving those perennial sacrifice areas with the hope that when we get off them in the spring, that we can come back there in the fall and use that as some winter grazing as we wait to get into the cropland, or as we use them in combination with the cropland and cover crops that are available at the time.
Sure. And can you talk a little bit about your choice of cover crops, or how you choose that, or your mix maybe?
Yeah.
Ratios, not necessarily specific varieties, but just some ratios that are helpful?
Sure. So, and this is just my slant on it. There's a lot of people using cover crops for a lot of different reasons, and that's the point of them, and the NRCS can help with those different applications. My point of that cover crop, the two biggest objectives, is to provide some fall grazing, fall into winter grazing, and also putting cover on a lot of that cropland that is not perennial, such as grass and alfalfa. perennial. So the deal with that, and again, a real additional benefit that I've really liked with the cover crops is that on our use side, we are breeding in October and November, and having those available cover crops, we're close to a 20% protein when they're grazing them, and there's no better way to flush and bring those sheep into condition to ovulate and really provide us with multiple births. And so in that case, we've moved our lambing percentages up on those Rambouillet based ewes from the 150s up to the 200%. And so that's been incredible, and what an extra outcome on a cover crop that certainly started for other reasons. The way I approach what mixes I put in there, cheap is important. I think we can get oversold on some of those cover crops because especially in dryland settings, you start pushing over $20, $30 an acre in seed on a maybe, especially in these drought years, and that's a deal breaker for a lot of people. I believe we can start having more surety into that as we get our system of agriculture in place better, because we'll have more moisture even in drought years. And I've seen a half inch of rain or less bring these cover crops up. And if we've got the moisture further down, those roots are going to get it and go even in drought years. So there's a lot of potential that way. But the ratio I use, again, is taking a rangeland approach. Most of our native rangelands, especially out in western South Dakota, are 80 to 90% cool season grasses. So what is a cheap annual cool season grass that I can plant in July when it's the hottest it is, and that will be ready for me and keep growing through July into September, October? And the answer is oats. Oats is cheap. It's easy to plant. You can broadcast it. You can seed it in. It comes up easy any time of the year. And then it was impressive. I was really happy with it this year as it was dry and we irrigate a lot of it, but it just kept growing. And as things cooled off, it did even better. The sorghum actually slowed down that we had mixed in it, but the oats came on well. And so the majority of my mix is going to be that type of cool season. I like to use a lot of winter annuals, like there's a forage winter wheat out, a variety called Willow Creek. It does very well, is highly nutritive in that vegetative state, so we try to get those planted in mid-August. So we've got that winter wheat canopied, and we can use that for flushing ewes and grazing cows that'll go back to milking even better for those calves. And we don't sell calves or wean until December. We're late April, May calvers. So again, those cover crops work great for us in coming off the native range and going right into a very high nutritive forage that we can provide to them and keep them calves gaining as we get into the later fall. And then I try to work in a legume, as there is 5 to 10% of the native prairies are going to have legumes intermixed with them. I haven't found one that I've been the happiest with yet, but the forage soybeans tend to hold a lot of promise there. And then I always bring in another broadleaf to emulate the native range in the form of a brassica, which the options would be dwarf Essex rapeseed is a good variety of rapeseed. The turnips and the radishes all provide those good opportunities, and they're great grazers, and cows and sheep both use them very well. So that's just my slant on it. It's about a 4-crop mix. A lot of people go other ways, but I try to keep that somewhere between $10 and $15 an acre just on the seed side.
Sure. Very, very, very helpful. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it. I want to make sure we haven't missed anything. Is there anything that we need to touch on that you feel like is something that's important to share?
Well, this is a system, and the bugger is complex. If you can keep it simple and use those rangeland management principles, I think that's the best way of approaching it. Most people are going to hesitate the implementation because there's a lot of things to think about, and they already know they're known, so they're fearful of going into the unknown. But I think this provides enough opportunity and promise that it's worth investigating.
Sure. What are some of the improvements that you've noticed as far as litter and stocking rate?
Yeah, you start noticing these subtle things, and a lot of it has to do is how far your water lasts. That's in these drought years. That's been the big deal. And certainly you can tell where my soils might be organic matter short, because every place a cow is urinated or plopped a cow pie, it's a lot greener and better growing there than elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your time today, Dave. One thing I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share some resources. Are there newsletters that go out from the Soil Health Initiative, or is there any kind of a resource that we could make people aware of? I would link to it in the show notes page, which will be workingcows.net/4. Do you have any resources that we can make them aware of?
Yes, these two coalitions are our best resources, and they're active, enthusiastic, passionate folks that have a real belief in trying to make agriculture successful in the future. And from their websites, you can get a lot more resources, and they have mentorships and people that have talked to you. And myself, I'm a voice for soil health, but that's the South Dakota Grassland Coalition and the South Dakota Soil Health Coalition. And you Google either one of them, you can find their websites and contact people. Certainly got great leadership in the state. We're very fortunate that way.
Yes, I've had an opportunity to interact with some of them, and they have been super helpful and open to the different ideas and things that I have proposed to them. So I really appreciate them, and there will be links to both of those coalitions at workingcows.net/4. Dave, I appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining us on the Working Cows podcast.
You're certainly welcome, Clay.
This episode is also brought to you by ChrisWilliamsAudio.com. If you're a musician, podcaster, or filmmaker, making your product sound great is crucial. Don't settle for audio that's less than professional. No matter what type of audio service you need, Chris Williams and his team have got you covered. Head on over to ChrisWilliamsAudio.com for all your audio production needs. Well, I hope that was a helpful episode for you. All of the links to the resources that we discussed, the South Dakota Grassland Coalition and the South Dakota Soil Health Initiative, will be linked at workingcows.net/4. So check out workingcows.net/4 for more information. Next week, we are going to sit down with Paul Youngnich and talk about his bale grazing study from Alberta. He is with Alberta Ag and Forestry, and they did a study a few years back on bale grazing and the effects of winter cattle feeding systems on soil nutrients, forage production, animal performance, and economics. Very interesting discussion. I can't wait to share it with you, so please tune in next week to the Working Cows podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.